Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
Two veils, one bride, and a secret. Welcome to Veil Files. I am your host, Thorn. Tell me where you're watching. I always enjoy your words. Let's unravel the mystery. It was in the early spring of 1989 that the singular affair of the bride who carried two veils engaged my friend's faculties. A thin rain had set the gaslights hissing upon Baker Street, and the foul temper of the weather had driven Holmes to his violin, and me to my armchair with the Army and Navy Gazette. I remember the scene with unusual clarity because of a trivial passage of arms that preceded our visitor. Holmes had ceased playing and was studying the ash of his cigarette with that abstracted air which, with him, meant not vacancy but the quiet assembling of little facts into some new design. "You have been in Fleet Street within the hour, Watson," he observed, without lifting his eyes. I laughed. "If you say so, I must have been, but the rain has kept me indoors all day. Nevertheless, your right cuff shows the gritty white dust peculiar to the steps of St. Bride's. The type on your Gazette is fresher than that sold in Marylebone, and there is the faintest smear of printer's ink upon your thumb, the sort acquired by a man who steadies a damp proof against his knee rather than by a compositor who carries it under his nails. You pause to exchange a word with our mutual acquaintance at the doorway of the Chronicle office. I trust he is in better health." Before I could deny or confirm this pleasant libel upon my movements, the jangle of the bell cut the air, followed by the rattle of a cab drawing short and a woman's quick, nervous step upon the stair. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman in his early 30s, pale and carefully dressed, whose high, strained manner spoke of nights without rest. Behind him, keeping to the door as if to bar pursuit, stood Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard with his hat in his hand. Between them, and drawing her veil closer as she entered, came a young lady whose grace and composure would have been remarkable in any company, and were doubly so in one so evidently tried by distress. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the gentleman managed with a bow that was nearly a stagger. "I am Godfrey Pelling. This is Miss Eugenia Harcourt. We beg your assistance upon a matter which the police—" "Which the police?" Lestrade put in dryly. "Have been asked to supervise, Mr. Holmes, though I am free to say it passes our patience. If the lady is willing to speak—" Holmes had risen and waved our visitors to the chairs by the fire. His keen gaze took in the tremor at Miss Harcourt's gloved fingers and the bandbox she hugged against her cloak. He inclined his head with unusual gentleness. "You will do us a service if you begin at the beginning, Miss Harcourt," said he. "In your own words and at your own pace." She removed the veil that obscured her features and showed a face of the English type, pale, fine, and resolute, with dark eyes that hinted at stronger currents beneath. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice was low but steady, "I was to have been married this morning at St. Bride's in Fleet Street." "I offer you my congratulations," said Holmes. "You will be quicker to offer them when the day is safe behind us," said Mr. Pelling, with a glance of angry devotion toward her. "As it is, the ceremony was interrupted." "Not by any disturbance in the church," Lestrade hastened to add. "Everything outwardly proper. But there's a robbery at the bottom of it, Mr. Holmes, and if you ask me, a confederate among the household." Miss Harcourt's hand tightened upon the bandbox. "The Harcourt star, Mr. Holmes, the diamond tiara that belonged to my grandmother. My father placed it in my keeping at 9 o'clock in a green morocco case. It was to be affixed to my veil just before we went in. I carried my veil with me, 2 veils, in fact. It is a custom in our family that the bride wears one for the church and one for the breakfast." "2 veils," murmured Holmes with a brief flicker of the eye toward the bandbox. "Pray proceed." My maid Alice O'Rourke had laid them ready at my father's house in Arundel Street. Madame Levin, the modiste, had sent them the previous evening. We drove to the church with my father, Mr. Pelling, and my cousin, Captain Lionel Pelling. The verger, Mr. Rooke, showed us to the vestry. There, I opened the morocco case to have the tiara fixed to the first veil, but the case was empty. Mr. Pelling's gloved hand came down upon his knee with a smack. And empty it has remained, for all the searching that has been done. There was no time for the ceremony to wait. The guests were assembled, the clergyman at the rails. We thought it some idle displacement, that it might have been placed in the bandbox by the maid. But it was not there. Miss Harcourt went to the altar with the simpler veil, only Lestrade's thin lips compressed. And after the formalities, we closed the vestry and went over every inch. The case shows no sign of force. The sacristy door was within my sight during the whole of the quarter hour before the service. The only persons with access were the parties named, the verger, and myself. Holmes joined his fingertips. A difficult conundrum indeed. You were given the morocco case at 9, Miss Harcourt. At what hour did you last see the tiara within it? At once, Mr. Holmes. I opened it to be assured, and I closed it again. At the 2 veils, are they within your bandbox at this moment? They are, and I beg you to look at them. She passed the box to him with the reverence a woman gives to some intimate portion of her attire. There is something more, she added, her composure at last wavering. At 8 this morning, a note was delivered to my room. It was unsigned. It said only, "Carry both veils to the church."
Holmes's brows lifted by the breadth of a hair. "Ah!" He took the square of folded paper which Lestrade produced from his pocket-book and held it to the firelight, sniffed it, and held it again against the flame so that the fibres glowed. Common machine paper, cut raggedly from a larger sheet. The ink is of a poor sort, such as is sold in penny sticks near the river, and you obeyed the instruction I did. It is true that our custom already provided for 2 veils, but I hadn't meant to carry both. I thought, Mr. Holmes, you will think me foolish, but the note terrified me. It seemed to watch me. I carried both. Holmes had lifted the first veil, a delicate piece of Brussels lace of such fineness that its pattern made a soft cloud in his hands. He turned it once, twice, and passed the edge between finger and thumb. Then he set it aside and took the second, identical to my eye in all respects. He weighed it in his palm, let it fall with the least flutter to the carpet, and, having thus satisfied himself of some point or other, drew from his pocket lens that instrument which I have seen throw the smallest of facts into extraordinary relief in his hands. "The work is excellent," he murmured. "Madame Levin is a name I know, yet it is sometimes the excellent who betray themselves by excellence. Tell me, Miss Harcourt, who touched these veils before they came into your hands this morning?" "Only Alice, my maid. She packed them last night. This morning she brought the bandbox and fastened the lid. We drove in one carriage, the 4 of us and the veils upon my lap. Captain Lionel Pelling sat opposite," Mr. Pelling put in. "He had no love for the thing, Mr. Holmes. The Star has ruined many a Harcourt with its gaming and pride. But if you hint—" "I hint nothing," said Holmes with a sudden brightness and a glance that quieted the younger man. "The office of hinting is the inspector's privilege. I collect facts. For example, Lestrade, you spoke with the verger?" "I did. Rooke has been there 15 years. Blameless, if you ask the rector. There's also the sacristan, Barnes, who brings the registers out. He swears he never so much as breathed on the case. Holmes bent so close to the lace that his aquiline nose seemed to trace the very threads. I saw him detach with the point of a penknife
a minuscule shred of something from the hem, so slight that I should have sworn it an illusion, and slip it, without comment, into his pocketbook. He next examined the comb sewn into the headpiece, sniffed at it, and, with a look almost of amusement, balanced it upon a finger. "Pray do not distress yourself, Miss Harcourt," said he, as our client's hands had begun to tremble. "There is nothing here that cannot be put right, if we are given a little time and your perfect candour. 2 veils, an empty case, a note, and a church, whose very dedication makes it an accomplice to a jest. You did not show the note to any person before the service?" "No one. I burnt it, and then, I'm ashamed to say, I rescued the fragments from the grate and pieced them in case you had need of them," Holmes finished, with a nod that carried no reproof. "You did. Wisely. And now, Mr. Pelling, who knew that the tiara would be worn today?" "Half London," Lestrade muttered. "The ladies talk, Mr. Holmes. The modisto would know, the maid, the jeweller who cleaned it, the cousin who cursed it, the papers that would gladly print it if it went missing." Holmes smiled, one of those quick, cold flashes that reveal the steel beneath his courtesy. "Then, since the circle of knowledge is large, we must narrow it by the circle of capability. Miss Harcourt, you and Mr. Pelling will do me the kindness to retain your strength and take some tea with my friend while I change my coat. Inspector, if your cab is at the door, we shall go at once to St. Bride's. There are certain threads." His finger touched, almost fondly, the lace upon his knee, "which are best followed before they are snipped." He rose, and as he passed, he set his hand for the briefest instant upon our client's shoulder. It was one of those rare gestures which told me how fully he had engaged his sympathy, and it did more, I think, to steady Miss Harcourt than all our assurances. I watched him go to his room with that peculiar quickness which means that some little thing has taken root in his mind. And when, a minute later, he came down with his long coat and his stick, the grey eyes were very bright, and the languor of the rainy afternoon had dropped from him as if it had never been. "You shall have your star back, Miss Harcourt," he said lightly, as he opened the door and the rain blew in. "For the present, keep both veils by you and let no one persuade you to part with either. There is more in a bride's headgear than most brides suspect." The cab, which Lestrade had kept at the curb, bore us swiftly to Fleet Street, where the sallow sky drooped close upon the black line of eaves, and the rain made a tremulous veil of its own before the tall, soot-streaked front of St. Bride's. Holmes, who had been silent the whole way, roused as we turned through the wicket into the little court, and put a question to the inspector with the briskness of a man stepping upon firm ground. "You closed the vestry at once after the ceremony?" "I did, and placed Rook within sight of the door while I took Miss Harcourt and the gentleman to their carriages. Barnes, the sacristan, brought me the register when we returned. He's waiting now. Excellent. Pray let no hand but mine touch what we find there." The verger Rook, a thin, respectable fellow with a face like a funeral card, admitted us and preceded us down a flagged passage that smelt of wet stone and old wood. The vestry door was locked, and from his pocket he produced a key of horn, apologizing for the damp, which made it turn stiffly. The room within was plain and neat, a high press for the vestments, a narrow fireplace, a cheap table laid with blotting book and pen tray, 2 chairs, and a window of bottle glass which made the light fall in greenish lozenges across the floor. There was also, on the nearest chair, a square of green cloth upon which, Lestrade told us, the morocco case had been set. Holmes stood just within the threshold, his hands in his pockets, and swept that cool, bright glance over the place. Then he crossed swiftly and dropped upon one knee beside the chair. The cloth was of a coarse,
church house sort, and along one edge it showed a darker band, as if it had been pressed by something heavy. He bent, peered, and gave a little grunt of satisfaction. Your cloth-keeper is not of the tidiest, Rook. See how the nap retains a foreign substance. Here are 2 scales, no, 3, of some adhesive, brownish and with a faint odour. He touched the edge with a finger, smelt it, and smiled sideways at me. Our old friend cobbler's wax, Watson. And here, upon the frame of the chair, feel it, still tacky, though the draught of your bottle glass has tried its best to dry it. Lestrade's narrow eyes sharpened. Meaning what, Mr. Holmes? Meaning that some person seated here prepared or employed a sticky appliance. You have observed, perhaps, that the catch of a morocco case will not yield readily to a finger. A little tackiness on a card or strip would steady a tool in a moving vehicle or lift what is within without disturbing its nest. Rook made a hissing intake between his teeth. Lord love us, sir, no one sat there after I laid that cloth, not till the lady came in. I set the case there myself, I did. Holmes's gaze flashed to him, and away again. You set the case, you did not sit. Quite so. Inspector, how long before the service did you first come into this room? 17 minutes. I looked in and out twice. The door was in my sight the last quarter hour. Then we will concern ourselves with what occurred before your vigilance, not during. Barnes! The sacristan came on a shuffle of boots, an elderly man with a mild, fish-like eye and roughened hands. He had the timid volubility of one much accustomed to authority and fearful of it. You fetched the register to this table? Holmes asked, tapping the blotter with a nail. Yes, sir, always to this table. Rector signs here, the party's here. And you fetched it today? I did, sir. 10 minutes before time, like. I laid it where you point to Holmes, lifted the blotting book by one corner, and held it to the window. The light showed upon the paper the ghostly negatives of signatures, Harcourt Pelling, the rector's round hand, together with a ragged smear of something that had transferred from a coarse fabric. Your sleeve, Barnes, has been at work, said Holmes lightly. No matter. Pray tell me who else entered. Here this morning, and keep to the truth. No one, sir, saving the inspector and Mr. Rook and the rector, and the lady with the veil. I swear it on the book itself. Holmes dropped the blotter, paced to the window, and set his fingers along the sill. The paint was old and scaly, and there, upon the inner edge, his lens discovered a minute crescent of green, which he coaxed gently free with the blade of his penknife. Morocco dust, he murmured, but far too little for a case lifted or set down. Rather the touch of something that had brushed the case and then brushed the sill. A thread, perhaps. He turned back to the chair and, with a deft movement, slid his hand palm down across the green cloth, then held his fingers to the light. A single hair, pale and wiry, lay upon them, glistening faintly with the same brown tackiness. Horsehair, said he. Modistes employ it sometimes to give body to lace. But horsehair smeared with wax is also a fowler's trick. We begin to have too many trades in one small room. Rook, have you among your flock a gentleman given to carrying a walking stick with a ferrule that unscrews? Rook gaped. Lestrade snorted. Captain Lionel Pelling is seldom without his cane, if that's your drift. But you're not going to tell me he fished a diamond tiara out of a shut case under our noses. I am going to tell you nothing yet, Holmes returned, with that sudden access of gaiety which with him meant a step gained. He rose, crossed to the table, and took up the pen tray. In one corner a grain of coarse white powder had sifted down, bigger than a pinhead. He touched it with the tip of his tongue. French chalk, he said. the sort a lady's maid will keep to her hand for drawing a tight glove or curing a squeak. Lestrade, your confederate in the household, may be the inspector's privilege. My business is with means and opportunity. We have now a sticky appliance here before the ceremony, a cane in the carriage, and a maid who handled both veils. We shall do well to see the veils in this light. He had brought the bandbox himself from the cab, and now, without ceremony, but with a delicacy that no woman could have bettered, he lifted first one veil and then the other to the greenish pane. Against that watery day, the lace bloomed in exquisite tracery, a cloud made of frost. He shifted his grip upon the headpiece so that the comb hung free. For a long moment he was motionless. Then I saw the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. "Watson," he said softly, "observe the fall of this hem. Do you see how the scallops lie level as the horizon? Now the other, there is, by the breadth of a sixpence, a heaviness here, at the third scallop from the left. No more than a suggestion. And the stitch above it is not the sister of its neighbour. It is younger by a day to my eye, I confessed. They are twins. To the common eye, just so." He turned, the second veil over, passed the lens along the hem, and, with that penknife which is as much his instrument as the surgeon's scalpel, teased at a speck so infinitesimal that I had taken it for a mote of dust. The hem, under that coaxing, yielded the very distance of a hair's breadth, and then lay quiet again. "We will not violate the lady's property in a vestry," said he, letting the lace fall, "but I will ask that these veils do not quit Miss Harcourt's keeping until I give the word. Lestrade, if any person requests to see or to borrow them, you will oblige me by noting the name and the hour." Lestrade cocked his head. "You're thinking the jewels in the lace." "I am thinking," said Holmes, smiling with his eyes, "that a thing may be both present and absent, Inspector, according to the sense in which one speaks. Come, we have squeezed St. Bride's till she gives no more. Our next business lies in Arundel Street." Rook protested that he would sooner cut off his hand than see his vestry the scene of any wicked device. Barnes added an aggrieved murmur regarding registers and the proper order of the church. Holmes soothed them both with an airy compliment, and we took our leave, the rain meeting us like beads on a curtain as we regained the cab. During the short drive westward, he sat with his chin sunk and his lids at half-mast, tapping, as is his custom, a silent tune upon the head of his stick. When we turned into Arundel Street, a sober row, with the river wind threading it and a porter lounging at one door, he roused, glanced keenly up at the facades, and sprang out before the horse came fully to a stand. Miss Harcourt's house was of that solid, old-fashioned sort, with a narrow hall and a smell of beeswax. We were shown into a morning-room where a fire had been hastily mended, and where the disorder of a bridal party still marked every surface, bouquet ribbon in a heap upon a chair, a glove lying palm up like a cast skin, a glass with the mark of a woman's lip. Mr. Harcourt, a grave grey gentleman with the air of one whom pride has long sustained and now deserts, rose to receive us. Godfrey Pelling stood at the window with his jaw set, and at the hearth, twisting her apron in nervous hands, was a young woman with a clear Irish skin and eyes red from weeping. Alice O'Rourke. Holmes addressed her as if there were no one else in the room. "You packed the veils last night. Who fastened the bandbox?" "I did, sir," she faltered. "Madame Levin's man brought them at 9 of the clock last evening. I laid them on the sofa there, oh, the poor lady, and I set the lid myself with 2 pins to keep the dust from them." "And this morning?" "This morning I brought the box down, sir, and I took up the lady's gloves and the little shawl, and Mr. Harcourt called for the carriage, and, oh, sir, We never thought there'd be any harm. Holmes turned to Mr. Harcourt. You placed the tiara in the green Morocco case at 9? At 9 precisely, said the old gentleman with a tremor of anger. I opened the safe myself, Mr. Holmes. My father wore that star when he was presented. I saw it with my own eyes and closed the case. Locked it? There is no lock. The catch is firm enough. Just so. Holmes's gaze travelled once more around the room, touching here a ribbon end, and there the faint ring left by a damp glass upon the table. He moved to the sofa, knelt, and from between cushion and arm drew forth a single stiff hair, paler than corn silk and glistening faintly at the tip. He held it on his glove and looked at Alice. You have a brother, I think, who once set snares in County Clare. The trick runs in the hand. She let out a little cry and clapped her palm to her mouth. Mr. Harcourt started forward. What is this? Girl, what have you to answer for? For nothing, for nothing wicked, sir, she sobbed. 'Twas only a message as said to carry both veils. E. Holmes lifted a finger, and the room fell still. We will have the story presently, said he, in a tone that was all kindness, and yet allowed no evasion. And when we have it, we shall have our diamond too. Alice O'Rourke stood before us, twisting her apron until it seemed in peril of tearing, her eyes darting from Holmes's impassive face to her master's stern one. The girl's distress was real enough, yet it was clear to me that Holmes had already fastened upon the exact measure of her knowledge, and that her next words would either confirm or contradict the suspicion taking shape in his mind. You received a message, you said? Holmes prompted gently, his tone carrying no hint of censure. This note, was it the same that bade Miss Harcourt bring both veils to the church? The maid swallowed hard. No, sir. Another one. I found it slipped under my door before dawn. It said only that I must not leave the veils unwatched, that if I valued my mistress's happiness, I was to carry them myself to her room. And you obeyed? She nodded, tears welling. I thought it queer, but it frightened me, sir. I'm but a servant. I feared disobeying might bring her harm. Holmes's eyes half closed, the lids drooping in that way of his which meant he was assembling every particle of evidence like counters in a sum. This note, have you kept it? Alice shook her head miserably. I burned it, sir. I feared being blamed, yet you recall its hand. It was in a scrawl, sir, all thick strokes, as if writ with a blunt quill. Holmes's mouth tightened, though he said nothing. Instead, he asked, When you packed the veils last night, were they as they appear now? Yes, sir, at least to my poor eyes. Madame Levin's man unwrapped them, and I laid them out. They seemed fine and new. Did he linger in this room? Only a moment. He was gone before the clock. Struck the quarter. Holmes turned to Mr. Harcourt. Was your cousin, Captain Lionel, present when the tiara was placed in the case? Mr. Harcourt frowned. He was in the library, I believe. He came later, offering to escort us to the church. Holmes gave a soft, non-committal hum. We must speak with him directly. But before that, I require a word with Madame Levin. This business of two veils interests me beyond all other details. Lestrade, pray have one of your men obtain the name of the messenger who delivered them, if such can be learned. Lestrade grumbled assent. Holmes's eyes swept the room one final time, alighting upon the half-burnt fragments still lingering in the hearth. With the tongs he drew forth a scrap of paper singed at the edge, its fibres too charred for words, yet enough to make him slip it carefully into his pocket-book. Even ashes have tongues, he murmured. Watson, we must not waste the afternoon. The carriage bore us swiftly to Madame Levin's establishment in Bond Street, where silks and laces lay displayed with all the pomp of Parisian fashion. The proprietress herself, a stately woman with jet-black hair and eyes too sharp for her otherwise languid demeanour, received us with a courtesy bordering upon hauteur. Holmes lost no time in his inquiries. "Madame, 2 veils were ordered for Miss Harcourt. Was that your design, or her request?" "It was mine, monsieur," she replied in her accented English. "The lady expressed no preference, but in her family there is tradition. I know such matters. I thought it proper she should have both, one for the altar, one for the feast." Holmes's gaze was piercing. "And you stitched both yourself?" "Certainly." "My girls prepared the lace, but I finished the hems with my own hands." Holmes produced the second veil from its box and held it delicately. "Then explain, if you please, why this stitch here is not your work." Madame Levin bent over the lace. Her eyes widened, and a swift, angry flush coloured her cheek. "This is not mine," she cried. "Who has dared alter my veil? I would never send such a clumsy stitch." "Precisely." Holmes folded the lace again with reverence. "One veil was tampered with between your atelier and Miss Harcourt's hands. Someone had opportunity either during its delivery or after it entered the house. Pray, madame, who conveyed it here?" She named her assistant, a young Frenchman called Jules Martel. "He is honest," she insisted, though foolish with dice and too fond of company. Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. "A useful combination, Inspector." We must locate this Jules from Bond Street. We returned again to Arundel Street, where Captain Lionel Pelling had by now come in from his club. He was a tall, fair man, with the flushed cheek of one too fond of the bottle, and a careless gaiety that seemed ill-suited to the gravity of the household. Holmes regarded him with that bland courtesy which to me is more formidable than cross-examination. "You are attached, I believe, to the Guards?" Holmes inquired. "I had that honour," Lionel replied lightly, "until fortune dismounted me." "The Guards, sir, are a less forgiving foe than the French." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet the Harcourt star was to shine again upon your cousin's brow. You did not approve?" Lionel shrugged. "Ah, my dear fellow, that bauble has ruined enough of us already. I should have been content to see it sunk in the Thames. But steal it? No, sir, I am poor, but not so poor as to risk the gallows." Holmes's eyes lingered a moment upon the captain's cane, leaning in the corner. He stepped forward, and with a word of apology unscrewed the ferrule. From the hollow within fell a narrow strip of card, smeared faintly with a brown residue. Lestrade uttered an oath. Lionel sprang to his feet, but Holmes raised a hand. "Calm yourself, Captain." This alone convicts no man, yet I think we are upon the scent of how the case was opened. The young man laughed harshly. "If some rascal has made use of my cane, I am the victim, not the villain." Holmes regarded him steadily, then replaced the ferrule. "We shall see. For now, I advise you not to quit the city." As we departed, Holmes's face was alight with inward fire. "Watson," he said as the cab wheels rattled us toward Baker Street, "we are engaged in no common theft. Mark this. The tiara has not left Miss Harcourt's side. It travels with her, though she knows it not. The question is not where it has gone, but how cleverly it has been hidden. And in that lies the heart of our mystery." He leaned back, the ghost of a smile upon his lips, and his fingers played absently with the shred of horsehair he had taken from the veil. The storm without seemed to redouble its patter against the windows, as though the very heavens were impatient for his answer. Holmes spoke little as we rattled back to Baker Street, but the gleam in his eye was enough to tell me that his thoughts were running at a pace far swifter than the weary cab-horse could manage. I had grown used to these silences and knew better than to disturb them, but even I felt a thrill of expectancy as we drew up at our familiar door. Once inside, Holmes cast off his coat, lit the lamp upon his desk, and spread the 2 veils across its surface with the same care one might devote to a rare manuscript. "Watson," said he, "we must treat these like the pages of a cipher, every thread a character, every stitch a possible alteration. Observe the hem again." He placed the magnifying lens in my hand and indicated a section near the comb. I bent obediently, but though I strained my eyes, I could see nothing more than lacework, finer than any I had ever encountered. "I confess, Holmes, it appears mere fabric to me." "Precisely. And that blindness, my dear fellow, is the very cloak our thief relies upon. A thing invisible to you is obvious to me, and therein lies the hiding place of the star." He drew from his pocket the sliver of horsehair he had taken at St. Bride's, and laid it against the lace. The faint tackiness of the wax made it cling. "This," he said, "was used not for trapping birds, but for guiding the thread. With patience, and I grant you no little skill, one could unpick a seam, insert a small object, and stitch it again so finely that only the closest scrutiny would reveal the tampering I started." "You believe the tiara is concealed in the veil itself?" Holmes inclined his head. "Not the entire piece, of course. The star is too large, but its stones are detachable, set in a manner that allows refashioning. A gem or 2 could easily be hidden within the breadth of a hem. The notion struck me with its audacity. But why then carry off the case at all? Why not leave it empty from the start? Because an empty case discovered too early would have betrayed the trick. Far better to let the bride herself carry it into the vestry, open it before witnesses, and only then find it empty. By that time, the true prize lies already upon her person, unsuspected and unsearchable." He sat back, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. "The question remains, who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to effect such a delicate operation? Madame Levin swears she did not. The maid insists she packed them untouched. And Captain Lionel, there lies a knot yet to be untied." At that moment Lestrade entered, his coat wet with the rain. He brought word that Jules Martel, the assistant from Levin's, had not returned to his lodgings since the previous evening. His landlady reported that he had been seen at a gambling house near Covent Garden, where he had lost heavily and departed with an unknown companion. Holmes's face grew keen. "A useful detail, Inspector. It seems our Mr. Martel has allowed both dice and villainy to guide his hand, yet I do not think him the true master of this stratagem. He is the tool, not the brain. Still, we must find him." Lestrade sniffed. "And what of Captain Pelling?" "That card in his cane is damning enough for me." "For me it is too damning," Holmes returned crisply. "It proclaims itself too loudly. When evidence leaps to the eye without effort, I grow suspicious. No, Inspector, the cane was used, but I doubt it was by the captain himself. Someone borrowed it, perhaps without his knowledge, and replaced it with just enough haste to leave a smear behind. Consider, would a man so careless as to keep the proof in his stick stroll home to face us without attempt at concealment?" "It is inconsistent with guilt," Lestrade grunted, but made no reply. Holmes had already turned his attention back to the veils. He held one against the lamplight and began to trace the hem stitch by stitch. Suddenly he uttered a low exclamation, and with the knife's point he lifted the tiniest fraction of thread. Something sparkled, so faintly it might have been a trick of the light. He prized delicately, and from within the lace drew out a single diamond, no larger than a pea, yet gleaming with cold fire. "Good heavens!" I cried. "The Harcourt star." Holmes said softly. Or rather, one ray of it, and the rest must follow the same path. A master stroke of concealment, but it cannot endure, for lace is a fragile guardian. The thief meant, no doubt, to reclaim the gems at leisure once the ceremony was over. Lestrade's eyes were round as saucers, and the thing has never left the lady's side at all. Exactly. Which means the culprit still needs access to her person in order to complete the crime. That is our advantage. He must act again, and we shall be ready. Holmes replaced the diamond and stitched the hem with a neatness that astonished me, his long fingers as deft as any seamstress. Then he folded both veils carefully and returned them to the bandbox. "Watson, you will accompany Miss Harcourt this evening. Remain at her side and permit no one, not maid, not cousin, not modiste, to handle the veils. I shall contrive another errand for myself. Our net must be drawn at the right moment." When he spoke thus, I knew better than to question him. That night found me seated in the Harcourt drawing-room, doing my awkward best to provide conversation, while Miss Harcourt's composure wavered between dignity and distress. Alice hovered nearby, red-eyed, but obediently keeping her distance from the bandbox. Mr. Harcourt paced like a man pursued by ghosts. It was near 9 o'clock when a footman entered with a note, delivered, he said, by a messenger who would not wait. Miss Harcourt broke the seal, glanced at the contents, and uttered a faint cry. She passed it to me with trembling hand. The words were stark. "Bring the veils to the garden at midnight, or the star is lost forever." Even as my pulse quickened, Holmes's earlier command echoed in my mind. Permit no one to touch them until he gave the word. I slipped the note into my pocket, resolved to obey. Yet I could not shake the sense that events were racing toward some dangerous climax. Somewhere in the rain-swept streets of London, Holmes was already setting his trap, while under this roof the unseen hand of the thief was preparing to strike again. The words of the note burned in my pocket as though they had been written in fire. I dared not alarm Miss Harcourt further, yet neither could I leave her in ignorance. She sat rigidly upon the sofa, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles stood white against the skin, her eyes fixed upon the bandbox as though it contained her fate entire. Mr. Harcourt muttered angrily at the fire, his lips forming phrases of outrage against cowardly scoundrels and insolence beyond bearing. Alice O'Rourke lingered at the doorway, glancing often at her mistress, guilt and fear warring in her expression. I judged it best to say nothing of the demand for the garden meeting until Holmes returned. The clock on the mantel crept toward 10. Each chime struck upon my nerves like the tolling of some fateful bell. At last, to my immense relief, there came the sound of a cab drawing sharply up before the house. A moment later, Holmes entered, the rain dripping from his shoulders, his hat pulled low over his brow. He seemed invigorated by the weather, for his eyes shone with an inner light, and there was an air of suppressed excitement in his movements. "Watson," said he, drawing me aside before greeting the others, "you have received a note." I started. "How could you know?" "Because I arranged that it should be so. Our quarry must be allowed to think his snare is working. Now, give it me." I passed it over. He scanned it once, then folded it with a smile that was all calculation. "Excellent. The hour named suits me admirably. Watson, you will bring the veils to the garden at midnight precisely. Let no one else carry them. You will remain visible, a tempting lure. I shall be near, though unseen. Have no fear, the villain will reveal himself." He turned to the company at large. "Miss Harcourt, courage for a few hours more. Your star is safe, though it blazes in an unlikely setting. Mr. Harcourt, restrain your indignation. It will serve us better after the capture than before." "Alice, Ah, Alice, it is fortunate for you that your affection for your mistress outweighs your discretion. A weak hand can be as useful as a strong one in guiding us to the truth, the girl stammered, but Holmes waved her protest aside. Enough. Now, Watson, let us pass the time in quiet until the stroke of 12. The house seemed to hold its breath as the night deepened. Outside, the rain slackened to a mist, and the lamps along Arundel Street glowed dimly, their halos blurred by the damp air. At 11:30, Holmes slipped silently from the room, saying only that he had a vantage to secure. I was left with the solemn duty he had set upon me. When the clock struck 12, I rose, took the bandbox under my arm, and, with Miss Harcourt's pale gaze fixed upon me like a benediction, made my way to the garden. The air was chill, heavy with the scent of wet earth and boxwood. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked to the centre, where a stone sundial stood, its shadow swallowed by the night. I had not waited more than a minute when a figure detached itself from the deeper dark beneath a yew. The lantern he carried threw his features into relief, a young man, nervous, his dark hair plastered by the rain. Jules Martel, the modiste's assistant. He advanced swiftly, his eyes darting about the garden. "Monsieur," he whispered hoarsely, "you have the veils? Quick, give them to me, and no harm will come." I steadied my voice. "They are here. But tell me first, by what right do you demand them?" His face contorted with fear. "I am commanded, sir. I have no choice. The lady will suffer if I disobey." Before I could answer, a shadow moved behind him with the swiftness of a striking hawk. A hand shot out, seized the lantern, and in the sudden darkness there came the unmistakable snap of handcuffs. Holmes's voice rang clear, edged with triumph. "Commanded indeed, my poor Martel, but you shall tell us by whom." The assistant gave a cry of despair. Lestrade stepped forward from the shrubbery, his revolver drawn, and 2 constables emerged from the far gate. The trap had sprung with precision. Holmes turned to me. "You played your part admirably, Watson. Now let us bring our bird inside. The cage awaits within the drawing-room. Under the fierce light of the lamp, Martel quivered like a trapped hare. Holmes regarded him with cold detachment. "You have skill with lace, Martel, but poor skill with conscience. Confess, who instructed you to alter the veil?" "I cannot," the fellow moaned. "He will kill me." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then I shall tell you. It was Captain Lionel Pelling. You were his companion at the gaming house. You lost together, and together you schemed. His cane provided the instrument, your hand the craft. He promised you gold if you stitched the diamonds into the veil. Am I wrong?" Martel's head dropped. A murmur of horror broke from the Harcourts. Mr. Harcourt's face grew purple with fury. "It is true," Martel whispered. "He said it was but a jest, that none would suffer. He gave me money for my debts. I was desperate. I did as he asked." Holmes's voice was like steel. "A jest that would have ended in ruin for an innocent woman. Inspector, you have heard enough. Place this man where he cannot tamper further with lace or with honesty. As for the captain, he will not sit so lightly when confronted with his accomplice's words." Lestrade barked orders to his men, and Martel was led away. Holmes then turned to Miss Harcourt with unexpected gentleness. "Your star is safe, madam. It shines still, though hidden in your veil. When you stand again at the altar, it shall be restored to its rightful place. But let this night remind us that even a veil, which should be the emblem of purity and trust, may become the mask for deceit. Happily, deceit, however cunning, cannot outlast truth." Miss Harcourt's eyes glistened with tears of relief. Mr. Harcourt wrung Holmes's hand in gratitude, though words failed him. Alice sank to her knees, murmuring thanks as though to a saint. Holmes merely shrugged off their praises, reached for his pipe, and said with the faintest trace of amusement, "Watson, I believe the hour grows late. Tomorrow we shall unpick the rest of the hem and restore the star to its crown. For tonight, let us be content that the bride's 2 veils conceal nothing more than stitches and a lesson in human folly." And so the case, though not yet at its absolute conclusion, had turned decisively in our favour, leaving only the final confrontation with Captain Lionel Pelling to bring the web of deception into full light. The morning after Martel's arrest broke clear and cold, a thin sunlight piercing the lingering mist above the Thames. Holmes had risen early and was already at his work table when I came down, his sleeves rolled, his eyes bright with the peculiar energy that comes upon him when the strands of a mystery begin to draw tight. Spread before him lay the veils, and beside them a small tray upon which gleamed several loose diamonds, 4 in all, that he had coaxed from their silken prison with infinite patience. "You see, Watson," he said, holding one of the stones to the light, "how cunningly they were set. Each gem was wrapped in a tiny sheath of waxed thread, then laid within the hem as though part of its weight. No casual glance, no nervous bridegroom's touch could have betrayed them. It is as fine a piece of criminal needlework as I have encountered, and all the work of Martel?" I asked. "Martel's hands, yes, but not his brain. He lacked the subtlety." The idea came from another, one whose interest in the ruin of the Harcourt star was as strong as his hatred for its glitter. A man of breeding, with debts that choke him, and a bitterness that drives him to crime. "You mean Captain Lionel?" I said firmly. Holmes smiled thinly. "I do." "And yet, Watson, conviction in the court of law requires more than inference. Martel has confessed, but a confession wrung from fear may not endure upon the stand. We must confront Lionel with proof so damning that even he cannot wriggle free." A rap at the door announced Inspector Lestrade, who entered with the brisk air of one who scents victory. "We have Martel safe in the yard," said he. "He has named Captain Pelling freely. We shall clap the captain in irons before noon." Holmes shook his head. "Do so, and you risk the collapse of the case. A man of Lionel's standing will hire counsel to paint Martel as a liar seeking to save his own skin. No, Inspector, the captain must condemn himself with his own lips. We must lure him into speaking, and to do that we must provide temptation." Lestrade looked sour, but Holmes continued, "Send word to Captain Lionel that Miss Harcourt requests his company this afternoon to discuss the unfortunate events. We shall be present, though unseen. Martel's confession will remain secret until then. The captain must be induced to believe the diamonds still concealed, their recovery possible only through his guidance. In greed or arrogance, he will betray himself. By 3 o'clock, we were once more in Arundel Street, concealed behind the folding screen in the Harcourt drawing-room. Miss Harcourt herself sat with admirable composure upon the sofa, the veils folded upon her lap. Her father stood stiffly by the mantel, every line of his figure proclaiming wrath held barely in check. Into this scene strode Captain Lionel, his boots ringing upon the floor, his cane under his arm, his manner one of forced nonchalance. "My dear cousin," he said, bowing with a flourish, "I am summoned at short notice, but always at your service. How fares our unlucky wedding party?" Still mourning the vanished star. Miss Harcourt's eyes, steady and cold, met his. "The star is not vanished, Lionel. It is here." She touched the bandbox gently. "It was hidden in the veil you watched me wear." For the first time, I saw him falter. His colour changed. He recovered swiftly, but Holmes's keen whisper in my ear Told me he had marked it too. A wild fancy, Lionel laughed. What thief would hide a jewel upon the bride herself? Preposterous. Not preposterous at all, said Miss Harcourt quietly. It was done, and the hand that devised it was nearer to me than I dreamed. Lionel's eyes narrowed. These are heavy words, cousin. Do you fling them at me? I speak only what the evidence demands, she returned, with a dignity that would have done honour to any queen. He flung out a hand in mock despair. Evidence! Lace and thread, perhaps. You cannot prove such nonsense. Unless... He stopped abruptly, his glance sliding toward the veils with a hunger he could not quite conceal. Unless you mean to search again. But I tell you, you will find nothing now. Holmes stepped from behind the screen like a conjurer revealing his trick. On the contrary, Captain, we have found much. Enough to restore the star to its rightful setting, and enough to hang a plot upon your shoulders. Martel has confessed he names you as his master. Lionel's face went white. He made a half-step toward the door, but Lestrade blocked the way. Stand fast, Captain. The game is up. You cannot prove it, he cried hoarsely. That wretch will say anything to save himself. I never touched the thing. Holmes's voice was calm as ice. Then how came your cane to bear the waxed card used in lifting the tiara from its case? How came Martel, a penniless assistant, to squander gold at the gaming table the very night he delivered the veils? And how, Captain, do you explain the note urging Miss Harcourt to carry both veils, a note written in your own hand, disguised but not beyond recognition? Lionel's lips trembled. He made no reply. Holmes drew from his pocket a small scrap of charred paper, the remnant I had seen him rescue from the grate. Even fire is no safe friend to the guilty. This fragment bears the curve of a letter and the blot of your clumsy pen. I compared it with your signature in the vestry register. The match is certain. The captain's shoulders sagged. He cast one desperate look at his cousin, whose gaze was all scorn and sorrow, and then at the door where Lestrade waited. I was ruined, he muttered. The star has cursed our house for generations. I thought, if I could sell the stones quietly, none would... No, and Eugenia would be spared the burden. Martel swore it would be easy. Easy, Holmes said sternly. To trick a bride upon her wedding day, to plunge her name into scandal, to betray your own blood? You mistake cowardice for ease. Inspector, your prisoner Lestrade snapped the irons upon Lionel's wrists. The man gave one choking sob, then straightened with an effort of pride and allowed himself to be led away. When the door closed, silence filled the room. Miss Harcourt rose, her veil still upon her lap, and turned to Holmes with eyes shining through unshed tears. You have saved not only the star, Mr. Holmes, but our honour. How can we ever repay you? Holmes bowed slightly. By wearing your veil at the altar without fear, madam, and by remembering that jewels, however bright, cast darker shadows than any cloud when they are allowed to rule the hearts of men. With that he gathered the veils and diamonds, replaced them carefully in their case, and handed them to Mr. Harcourt. Then, lighting his pipe, he turned to me with that familiar twinkle of dry amusement. Come, Watson. Our work here is concluded. Perhaps you may even persuade me to dine this evening, provided the fare does not involve veal. My appetite has had its fill of veils. And thus the affair, with all its cunning deceit and perilous twists, drew toward its close, though I confess my admiration for Holmes's foresight and delicacy in unravelling so tangled a skein has seldom been greater. The noon papers had scarcely finished crying Captain Pelling's disgrace when Mr. Harcourt's man arrived,
with the Morocco case and the veils, as Holmes had requested. My companion received them with the delicate gravity of a curator, set the tray of recovered gems beside them, and drew the blinds so that a cool, even light fell upon his work table. He did not speak for some minutes. With the lens at his eye and the fine-pointed knife laid ready to hand, he traced the hems as a navigator might, the coastline of an unknown shore, pausing now and again to coax forth another minute parcel from the lace and to lay it with its fellows, clear drops of frozen lightning, upon the dark bays. "Count with me, Watson," he said at last, in that quiet tone which is as bracing as a trumpet where facts are concerned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the left sweep, 4 upon the right, 2 smaller stones for the shoulders, and these 4 that we took at dawn. What total do you make? 15, I replied after a careful reckoning. 15, he repeated. He reached for a paper which Mr. Harcourt had sent with the case, a yellowing valuation prepared, so the heading declared, 20 years before by a Hatton Garden firm. He tapped the line with a finger. The Harcourt Star, 16 brilliants in old mine cut, 1 principal stone estimated at 42 grains, mounted en diadème, that is to say, 17. We are short by 2. I felt a chill that was
not of the shaded room. 2 Holmes? But we took the veils entire as they came to the house, said he, but not entire as they left the atelier. Martel, by his own account, distributed the stones where he dared, but he did not hazard the principal. It would distort the fall, draw the eye, and betray the scheme. There remains also, you perceive, one of the companions. Let us see whether either is here and hidden beyond my poor wit. For a quarter hour he persevered, and I learned anew the patience of that searching mind. When at last he pushed back the lens, there lay upon the cloth the same austere tally, unswelled by any luck of chance. "Too absent," he said softly. The light in his eyes had grown colder. Now we have a tale within a tale. Lionel contrived his comedy of veils, but someone has played a tragedy behind his back, and earlier. Tell me, Watson, what is the first name that offers itself when one asks Haxixu who could detach a principal stone and send it into the world without clamour? The jeweller who last handled it, I answered, catching his drift. Just so. You recall that the inspector, in his first survey, spoke of a cleaner of jewels? I sent a wire at daybreak to Mr. Harcourt. His reply came an hour since he put before me a neat note in a clerk's hand. The tiara was to Mr. William Varden, Hatton Garden, on Tuesday last, for cleaning and inspection. Returned Wednesday at 4 o'clock. That would be the day before the wedding. Pray take your hat. Hatton Garden at that hour had the air of a fair, where the booths had been swept, but not yet thronged. In Varden's window a crescent of paste tiaras blazed like noon suns, and beneath them lay a cunning litter of velvet trays, snips of wire, and cards with gilt borders, merchandise for the eyes, if not for the purse. Mr. Varden himself proved to be a thin, smooth man whose eyelids drooped as if to shade pearls of discretion. He greeted us with a bow that kept 3/4 of his height in reserve. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a privilege. How may I serve you? With your candour, said Holmes pleasantly, you had the honour to clean the Harcourt Star last week. A mere brushing, sir. I could not improve upon nature. His smile showed excellent teeth. Holmes drew out the Morocco case, opened it, so that the recovered stones gleamed upon the cloth as witnesses, and let the silence do its work. Varden's smile stiffened by a degree. A beautiful parure, he murmured. I rejoice to see it safe. You rejoice prematurely, Holmes rejoined. You will observe that the principal and one companion are lacking. It is possible, and here he gave that little deprecating wave which I have learned to fear on a culprit's behalf, that in the act of brushing you found a looseness and, being zealous, removed the great stone for security. The jeweller spread his hands. My dear sir, I should not presume to dismount a family jewel without commission and receipt. I returned the tiara precisely as I received it. Holmes's glance, seemingly careless, took in the little details that are a tradesman's involuntary biography, the rouged crease upon the thumb, the faint rub of emery on the cuff, the infinitesimal reddish sparkle caught in the grain of the deal counter where rouge had been ground too freely. He lifted the glass paperweight. Beneath it lay a square of tissue with 2 pin pricks and a smear in a crescent. He set it down again without comment. Then perhaps you will do me the favour to compare these with your ledger, said he, indicating the stones. I am less skilled than yourself and would not have you doubt my figures. Varden hesitated, then took up his lens. I marked how he lingered upon the smallest of the brilliants and how his breathing shortened as he came to the last 2. When he had finished, he placed his hands upon the glass case as if to steady them. They have the tone and water of the Harcourt pieces, he admitted. The principal, as you say, is not among them. Nor in your safe, Holmes suggested, amiably as ever. The lids drooped a shade further. Mr. Holmes, you press me as if I sat in the dock. I have a reputation. If you have any shadow of proof— Holmes's voice, when it came, had the silken edge that means a steel intention beneath. My proof will be sufficient when I lay it before the law. For the present, I satisfy myself. Your rouge is the old crocus, slightly adulterated. Note the purplish cast. You grind it overmuch. Your tissue shows a crescent rub of the oval setting of a principal stone. On Wednesday last, a cabman from Arundel Street waited at your door an hour. Your boy told me so cheerfully, and you sent him away twice while you were still at it. Add to this that you have lately paid your account with Mortlake and Company, dealers in unmounted stones, after 3 months' arrears. Shall we continue the catechism? The jeweller's lips had gone dry. This is monstrous, he whispered. You trade in inference. Inference is not proof, nor is silence innocence, returned Holmes with a bow. Come, Watson. On the pavement he drew a deep breath, as if the air there were cleaner. He has it, or he has had it, he said. He will not risk offering it in London, not yet. The police at my word would close his premises and we might find a dozen past indiscretions, but the great stone could be elsewhere by nightfall. No, we must draw him, as we drew Martel, by his necessities. You mean to leave him at liberty? I exclaimed. For 6 hours, said he. It is enough time for a guilty man to make a decisive error, and too little to repair one. We shall make it known, sub rosa, that the Harcourt Star will be reset tonight at 9. Varden will see his last gate closing. If the stone is in his keeping, he will contrive some way to replace it, quietly. If it is already past, he will make a frantic cast to prevent discovery. Either course puts his hand within reach. Meanwhile, I must ask you to perform a service that calls for an old soldier's nerve. You have only to name it, I said. You will escort Miss Harcourt and her father to Varden's at 8:15, with the bandbox, the case, and those 15 stones in your pocket. You will speak of nothing but a desire to end all scandal by finishing the setting at once. You will be patience itself if he delays. You will be adamant if he proposes to send the work round to a more convenient bench. I, for my part, shall be at hand, perhaps in a shape you will not admire.
When he spoke thus, I had visions of him as ostler, groom, or decrepit grandam, nor was I wrong. At 8, precisely, we presented ourselves in Arundel Street. Miss Harcourt's composure had the white lustre of a blade's edge, while Mr. Harcourt's jaw was set as for a duel. The cab bore us swiftly to the garden. As we alighted, a limping crossing sweeper with a cap drawn low hobbled from a doorway and swept, with excessive zeal, the already clean step before Varden's shop. He did not lift his head, but the one grey glance he shot along the street told me all I cared to know. Varden received us with honeyed haste. "My dear madam, Mr. Harcourt, to be of service after such vexations. What an honour! Pray be seated. We shall have the setting perfected in a trice. Only—" and here his eye slid toward the inner door. "Only my principal bench is in the back, where the light is better, if I might—" "You might not," said Mr. Harcourt, with a dignity that recalled the days when men said what they meant. "My property shall not quit my sight. Do your work here?" Varden bowed so low that his smile nearly touched his boots. "As you wish," he murmured, and turned to draw the bolt of the inner door. In that instant the limping sweeper straightened like a blade springing free of its sheath. The limp vanished, and Sherlock Holmes stepped within, as natural as a man entering his club. "Permit me, Mr. Varden," said he, with the most affable of bows. "It is as well that all doors remain open when we set a star back in its heaven." For an instant no one breathed. Varden's hand, arrested upon the bolt, hovered as if between two worlds, the one in which he still held his reputation, and the one to which a single decisive motion would consign him. He let the hand fall with elaborate care, and conjured a smile that sat badly upon his lips. "But certainly, Mr. Holmes," said he in silken tones, "all doors open. Our trade thrives upon light." He moved behind the counter and drew forward a leather pad, a clamp, and a tray in which lay shellac, a pinch of borax, and a pair of fine-nosed pliers. "If madam will entrust me with the pieces, we shall give them back their old conversation." Miss Harcourt laid the morocco case upon the pad with a composure that I admired more with every trial it endured. Holmes posted himself where he could see both the inner door and Varden's hands. I took station at Miss Harcourt's shoulder. Mr. Harcourt stood square, his stick planted as if upon a parade ground. "You will forgive my punctilio," Holmes observed mildly, "if I ask that we first count the stones in company." Varden's drooping lids fluttered. "By all means." He ran the brilliants under his glass with a little murmur, as if soothing a fretful child. 15. He paused no thicker than a heartbeat upon the emptiness where a larger fire should have burned, then let the stones patter back into the dish. "The principal and one shoulder, as we told you." An unfortunate looseness, discovered too late. "Discovered by whom?" said Holmes. Varden did not answer directly. He turned to a drawer, took out a shallow saucer, and with the air of a man conceding a minor truth, set it on the pad. Its white glaze showed a faint, purpled smear in crescent, like the shadow of a thin moon. "Your crocus rouge," Holmes remarked, "and your oval setting." "It is well, Mr. Varden. The past will have its way whether we abet it or no. Pray proceed." With the 15 he yielded the least space of the counter, and in that space Varden placed the diadem mount, its vacant bed for the principal, an empty throne that gave the whole a melancholy air. He began to set the recovered stones with practised accuracy. It was beautiful work, so beautiful that for a moment I almost forgot there was villainy in the room. His hands were steady, the shellac took, the borax hissed faintly where the lamp's tiny flame kissed it. Yet even as he worked, I saw sweat spring at his temple, and run in a clear line through the fine powder that dusted his skin. Twice he reached toward the inner door. Twice Holmes's voice, casual as a friend's, turned him back. "You will find, I think, all you require upon this bench." "Aye, merely the better light," Varden murmured. "The front is quite luminous," Holmes returned. The hand of the clock upon the glass case crept toward 9. Outside, the street noise altered in that subtle way a Londoner knows, the oncoming breath of evening crowds. Varden set the 15th stone and stepped back with a faint, affected sigh. There. The poorest part made rich again. If you will now permit me, since we cannot conjure a principle out of air, I shall fit a temporary paste to preserve the line. Later, when the great stone is recovered—" "It is recovered," said Holmes quietly. Varden's head jerked, his eyes flicked, not to us, but to the door, as if the word had been a rap from without. In the very beat of that silence there came the skitter of feet upon the pavement, a tap upon the glass, and a boy, breathless, cap askew, thrust an envelope into the crack Varden made with his palm. "From Mortlake! Urgent!" he gasped. Holmes did not move. He watched the jeweller open the paper with a thumb that shook despite his effort at nonchalance. Within was a small round tin such as watchmakers use, wrapped in tissue whose centre showed, even through the folds, that same faint purple crescent I had marked before. Varden lifted the lid, and for the space of a sigh the room brightened, as if a captive sun had been restored to the sky. Even I, no lover of such trappings, felt that throb which the marvels of earth can stir in a man. "The Harcourt star," Holmes said. "Or, if you prefer precision, the principal stone of it. You see, Watson, that necessity is the best of our allies, Mortlake, with my assurance that this setting must be finished tonight before witnesses, and with the certainty that the Yard would look into all recent purchases at dawn, has preferred to be an instrument of restitution. Their boy has run well," Varden swallowed. "You have concerted this." "I have let the truth take its own course," Holmes returned. "Finish your work, sir. We will not keep a bride waiting for her coronet. There are moments when the strongest man is but the toy of circumstance." Varden, seeing every door closed but one, walked into the trap with the fatal dignity of a player who knows the game is ended and will play out his hand without wine. He set the great stone in its bed. Holmes leaned, so that the lamplight fell obliquely across the crown. "At 2 o'clock upon the girdle you should find a feather," he murmured. "The valuation of 20 years ago notes it. A family flaw is a safer signature than any seal." Varden forced the loop to his eye, nodded, and made the last neat pass that gave the setting its bite. When he stepped back, the Harcourt star looked down upon us all with that cold serenity which the innocent and the costly share. "One remains," Holmes said, and though the voice was even, I felt the steel in it. "The companion stone." For the first time, Varden's composure cracked. "I cannot," he whispered. "I cannot conjure stones." Holmes lifted his hand. "You cannot conjure, no, but you can fetch. We will help you. Inspector?" The inner door opened upon Lestrade, who had been within the back shop since Holmes's entrance, and who now came forward with a business-like air, and a smudge of ash upon his cuff that did not belong to his toilette. "We have the bench and the safe," he announced. "Your boy," he nodded toward the messenger, "was met at the corner by my man and relieved of a second tin addressed to a Mr. Pike at Maiden Lane, who will be extremely disappointed in his evening. This one held the shoulder stone. I suggest we close the circle." He set the tin upon the pad. Varden stared at it, as a thirsty man might stare at a glass
that has been filled and withdrawn too often. "I am ruined," he said, in a toneless voice. Holmes's reply was without rancour. "You have preserved your liberty by minutes, and by our forbearance. Had the star gone a farther stage, you would have exchanged this counter for a cell, set the companion, and give us what peace we can take from a bad business put right." He obeyed. The little stone dropped into its seat with a modest gleam, like the true friend beside a sovereign. When the final touch was made, Mr. Harcourt stepped forward, his nostrils quivering with a feeling he fought to master, and closed the case. He turned to Miss Harcourt, whose face had at last softened from marble to living flesh, and put it into her hands. "Child," he said, and there was a break in the word I had never heard from him, "I think your mother would be pleased." Holmes drew out his watch. "We have kept our hour," he observed. "Inspector, you will take Mr. Varden's statement while the courage in him holds. Later, you may consider what charge is fit. I am content if the star sleeps this night where it should." "Tomorrow will serve for law." Lestrade grunted assent and motioned the jeweller toward the back. Varden paused, his hand upon the inner door that he had been so anxious to close, and looked once at Miss Harcourt. "Madam," he said, with a strange, dry humility, "your mercy, if you can find any, will be a better investment than my trade has proved." She inclined her head without speaking. When he was gone, the three of us stood a moment in the small hush that follows a storm. Outside, London's evening had thickened to its sober glow. The street lamps burned like tame planets, and the traffic went about its endless weaving with that indifferent music which is the city's heart. Holmes took up his hat. "There remains," he said, as if we had been talking of trifles, "one small knot to be cut. The authorship of the first note, to Alice O'Rourke. Martell, I think, but let us be exact. Exactness is the final courtesy one pays a finished case." "And after that?" I asked. He smiled with that sudden softness that in him stands nearer to warmth than any other expression. "After that, Watson, we give the world back one quiet wedding and pretend for an hour that veil and star are what they appear, a lace cloud and a fallen piece of heaven, and not the flints over which poor human feet will always stumble." We left Hatton Garden with the morocco case secure beneath Mr. Harcourt's arm, and with Lestrade, for once, content to let prudence govern zeal. Holmes, who had preserved a genial front throughout that delicate hour, walked in silence as far as Holborn, where the flow of the crowd wrapped us round like a river. Then he said, more to himself than to me, "Exactness, Watson. We will not leave a loose end to trip an honest woman on her wedding morning." "You mean Alice's dawn note?" I returned. "You suspect Martell." "I dislike suspicions," he answered. "I collect facts until they stand so close they touch. Then they are no longer suspicions but a figure in a glass that any man may see he hailed a hansom to Nottingham Court, Covent Garden. Martell's lodgings were of that mean, respectable sort in which vice pays for clean steps and a potted geranium to keep up appearances. The landlady, a narrow person with a mouth as prim as a seam, bobbed and pursed when Holmes showed his card. "The gentleman is in custody, sir." "Scotland Yard was here, so were we earlier," Holmes said, with that air of omnipresence which unnerves the innocent and convicts the guilty. "You mentioned, I think, a desk where he wrote his letters." She hesitated. A coin changed hands with a sleight I could not have matched, and the door of Martell's little room opened. There were the poor stage properties of his life, a frayed coat on a peg, a box of pastilles, the inevitable little shrine of a Frenchman,
cheap lithograph of a saint and a pinch of artificial flowers, and upon a rickety table a packet of notepaper tied with faded ribbon, a blunt steel pen, and a stick of the inferior ink such as Holmes had sniffed at in Baker Street. "The paper," Holmes murmured, and loosened the ribbon. The top leaf was gone. Beneath it lay 2 sheets, with the faintest rucking at the upper edge where a careless hand had torn away a page. He drew a roller from his pocket, one of those little contrivances of his own, devising rubbed with soft graphite, and passed it delicately across the blank. As the powder settled, lines grew upon the fibres like a photograph in a bath. The thing seemed to shape itself out of air, and there, in clumsy strokes with heavy down-sweeps, stood the words I had half expected to see. "Do not leave the Vales, carry them yourself to her room, if you value her happiness." Holmes's eyes, when he lifted them, had that dry sparkle which is as near to triumph as his temper permits. "There is your courtesy of exactness, Watson. Note the blunt descent of the Y and the clubbed F. Compare them with Martel's signature to his lease, 'Thank you, madam,' and with the IOU he left last week at the Green Ram, 'Thank you again.'" He had already coaxed the landlady to produce both from her tidy hoard. The likeness was plain even to my untrained eye. "And the envelope?" I asked. He held up a cheap yellowed wrapper from the waste-basket. The flap had been gummed with saliva, and upon the inner triangle a smear of brownish tack remained. He touched it, smelt it, and smiled. "The same cobbler's wax that perfumed the vestry chair. Martel is no fowler, but he is a tailor's drudge. He handles horsehair and wax as naturally as you a stethoscope. He wrote to the maid at dawn to keep the bandbox under her own hand, lest any other servant, not in his pay, should meddle with it. Later, Lionel wrote to Miss Harcourt to bring both veils so that the treasure might be carried into church upon the very head it was meant to adorn. There is a curious chivalry in scoundrels, Watson. They will dress their plots. In the language of protection, we left the landlady more than content and drove directly to the yard, where Lestrade, eager to complete his net, had Martel produced. The little man's bravado had run out of him like rain from a cracked gutter. Holmes laid the impressed sheet before him without a word. Martel's fingers made a feeble plucking motion and fell. "It was only to keep them safe," he muttered. "I did not mean harm to the lady." If any hand but mine had touched the veils, the stitches, oh, monsieur, the stitches, they might have been seen. "Your compassion," said Holmes with a coolness that kept pity in its place, "led you to stitch another woman's wedding lace with stolen light. Spare me your sentiment. Answer this. Who let you into the vestry before the inspector set himself to play watchman?" He flinched. "No one. I was never there." Holmes's brows arched. "You were not. I am gratified to have that confirmed." The cobbler's wax upon the chair and hair upon the cloth came from the veils themselves when Miss Harcourt set her bandbox down, and the tack upon the chair frame was laid there by a hand that needed a steadier purchase for a trick with a card. The vestry is an after chapter. The act was played in the carriage. Martel stared, then gave a little gasp of understanding. "The cane," he whispered. "It was always the cane." "Just so," Holmes returned. "Captain Lionel's hollow ferrule held the prepared card. He could not pluck a coronet from a shut case in a crowded pew without being noticed, but in a jolting brougham with a bride's bouquet waved under eyes and talk in the air. Then a touch, a lift, and the metal mount slides from its bed to his pocket. You see, Watson, why the smear upon the vestry cloth was too neat. It was made in comfort, not in haste. It betrayed not Martel's presence, but Lionel's need of tack upon his fingers when he opened the case before they went into the register. The case
Empty, oh, the lamentations, and the true jewel walking up the aisle upon the lady's brow. Lestrade snorted approval. A pretty devil's minuet, and what of Varden? Will the law? The law will, if the Harcourts insist, but I think they will be content with restitution and his written confession touching the principal and the shoulder-stone. I prefer a penitent craftsman to a notorious cause, and the Star is safer in the world when fewer mouths have tasted its scandal. We left the yard as the early dusk drew its veil across the streets. Holmes, who had smoked in silence for a dozen paces, blew a thin thread of smoke and said, "There remains only to make our account to our clients. I confess, Watson, I have a fondness for closing a ledger with the figures neat along the rule. Arundel Street received us as if nothing had happened. Lamps lit, a maid's step upon the stair, the faint domestic clink of china. Yet the air within that drawing-room held a new stillness, like a house after illness that has seen its patient breathe freely. Miss Harcourt rose. Mr. Harcourt advanced with grave warmth. Godfrey Pelling, whose outward composure had scarcely masked the nights he had walked, met us with a pressure of the hand that said more than any speech. Holmes, with an ease that was half jest and wholly kindness, set the morocco case upon the table and opened it so that the crown winked at us in severe gaiety. "Your star, madam, with its fault upon the girdle. Do not part with that. It is as honest as the family motto." He closed the case again, and with that little formal inclination, which is his tribute to a courageous woman, put it into her keeping. Mr. Harcourt's lips moved, but Holmes forestalled him with the history in brief. No rhetoric, no flourish, only the plain stages each laid upon the next, until the whole stood foursquare. The note to the maid, the note to the bride, the card in the ferule, the wax, the horsehair, the jeweller's crescent smear, the boy from Mortlake, the floor at 2 o'clock, the chain complete. When he had done, there was a quiet that I shall remember as long as I remember that honest old gentleman's face. He took Holmes's hand in both his own. "Sir," said he, "there are debts that cannot be paid in money. You have given me my daughter's good name back again, and, what is not for me to speak of, her future." Godfrey Pelling stepped forward then and spoke not to Holmes but to the woman he loved. "Eugenia," he said, and there was that in the utterance of her name which made me look at the hearth. "Shall we be married tomorrow as we meant? I will walk with you whether you wear a star or a daisy." Her answer, though low, had the ring of a thing that would not change. Holmes's eyes softened a fraction. He busied himself with his gloves. It was then that Alice O'Rourke, who had hovered at the outskirts of the scene, like a ghost uncertain of its welcome, came timidly nearer. "Sir," she faltered to Holmes, "am I to be turned away?" "I did a wicked, foolish thing." "You did a fearful, foolish thing," Holmes returned, not unkindly. "You obeyed a scrap of paper instead of the mistress whose face you knew. But you obeyed, as you thought to serve her. If Mr. Harcourt keeps you, let it be upon a firmer obedience, the sort that looks a note in the face and takes it to its owner." Miss Harcourt went to the girl and took her hand, so that knot, too, was untied without a roughness more than the night had already brought. In the cab, as we rattled home through the wet gleam of lamp-lit streets, I said, "You have left nothing undone, Holmes." He smiled, a mere ripple at the corner of the mouth. "There is always something undone, my dear fellow. Tomorrow I shall sleep an hour later. That will be my tribute to exactness." He stretched his long legs and let his head rest against the cushions. "And then, when the ring has been spoken and the veil lifted, we will go to Baker Street and set down the steps of the case from first to last. It will read, I think, better as a demonstration than as a romance, but you, with your soldier's pen, will mend that defect. Only, Watson, do not forget the cobbler's wax. It is the little vulgarities that betray the grandees. We were not early risers upon the morrow. Holmes kept his promise to exactness by granting himself an extra hour, and when at last he came to the table, gaunt and serene, the coffee had lost a degree of its steam, and the morning papers had gained a dozen paragraphs on the baffling bridal robbery. He glanced over the columns with that sideways amusement which notoriety in any form awakens in him, and dropped them without comment when a boy from the yard brought Lestrade's brief wire. Pelling charged with conspiracy and theft. Varden's statement taken. Martel remanded. Boy from Mortlake Cooperative. Publicity to be moderated at your suggestion. Holmes read it twice, folded it once, and put it into his letter weight, as a man lays a stone upon a cairn when a stage of the road is done. "We shall go to St. Bride's," said he. "A case properly finished must be finished where it began. Besides, Watson, I have a fondness for seeing an object restored to its right use. A jewel is best not in a pawnbroker's tin, nor in a lawyer's envelope, nor even in a morocco case, but where it was meant to lie. Put on your best hat. We must look as if we came to admire, not to watch." The church showed a braver face than it had worn under the previous day's rain. The sky was a dry blue, pale light sifted down the well of the nave, and the verger, Rook, with a dignity composed of starch and habit, received us as if we had never troubled his vestry. The sacristan Barnes bobbed and smiled in his fish-like way, and made much of straightening a register that needed no straightening. Holmes's eye missed nothing, and dwelt upon no one. We were shown, without request, a place just within view of the chancel rail. Miss Eugenia Harcourt came up the aisle upon her father's arm, as if she had been carved for that exact passage, and set at last in motion. The tiara sat upon the veil like a star caught in a cloud. When she paused at the rail, the light drew off the great stone a fine cold ray, and, if I am fanciful, I will say I saw it too upon the girdle that little feather Holmes had spoken of, which seemed to me then the most human part of the thing, since it kept a floor of the earth in the very heart of the glitter. Godfrey Pelling stood with a steadfastness that would have satisfied any surgeon. His colour did not waver, and when the two voices were made one, I felt the occasion pass over me with that quiet pressure the English can give, to joy when they have paid for it in anxiety. Holmes, who affects indifference to ceremonial, watched with a stillness that was not indifference. Once only he stirred, when a curious gentleman whose black coat and inquisitive eye proclaimed the reporter in every fold, strayed too near the vestry door. A glance from Holmes was enough. The fellow lost his path and found himself, to his own surprise, in the south aisle among the hatchments. There was no incident. If any hand had dreamt of repeating yesterday's audacity, the presence of honest happiness in that place was guard enough, and the discreet bar of Lestrade's arm at the west door worked the rest. Bells rang, the register took the new names upon itself with genteel blotting, and the world, which is always in haste to close a chapter once the end is known, breathed, bowed, and went away content. At the breakfast in Arundel Street we were made welcome with the warmth which follows danger averted. The old gentleman had found his natural temper again. His wit, dry as a biscuit, returned to him in crumbs, and I marked how he pressed Alice O'Rourke to take wine, and how she coloured and said, "No, sir," as if the syllables themselves were a vow. Madame Levin, stately and all contrition, was there to admire her own handiwork, and to assure any who would hear that no needle under her roof should again conspire with wickedness. Holmes endured gratitude with a patience that would have made a saint peevish, and at last, when the moment offered, drew me a little apart to an alcove where the morning glowed through clean glass upon a pair of primroses. "There is one small item," said he, "which my affection for the inspector forbade me to parade before him, lest the poor man think me addicted to theatricals. You recall that first small stone we drew from the hem in Baker Street?" "Very well." "I replaced it," said Holmes, and the ghost of mischief crossed his features, not for concealment, but to verify the line of pressure. If our midnight caller had been another hand than Martell's, if, for example, some servant with a meddlesome conscience had sought to unpick the thing, he would have tugged where the weight lay wrong. I should have found broken thread and clumsy needle bore in the morning. Instead, when you carried the box to the garden and back, the hem took no damage. Therefore the enemy to be expected was the same that had done the work, the only creature tender enough to rescue his own stitchery without betraying it. Our net, you perceive, had the right mesh. You used the diamond as a telltale, I said. "Holmes, do you ever hesitate to risk a cast when the stake is another's piece?" "I risked nothing," he answered quietly. The stone could not be lost twice. Every gate by which it might pass was shut, and I held the keys. Do not confuse hazard with design. Besides, and here he let his shoulder rest for an instant against the frame, Miss Harcourt showed me more steadiness in 2 hours than most men show in 20 years. One should earn such steadiness if one uses it. Godfrey Pelling joined us then, and would have broken upon a speech, but Holmes forestalled him, as he had the father the night before, and begged him instead to take his wife to the window, that she might see how May looks from the inside of a promise. When they had gone, Mr. Harcourt came, and in a few blunt words offered us a recompense as weighty as his gratitude. Holmes shook his head. "Sir, pay your jeweller's boy double his fee for running well, keep your maid, and if you will set me in your books for any favour, let it be a free hand to borrow for a day the tiara, not to wear, I assure you, but to compare its old mine water with a set of Cape stones, whose behaviour puzzles me. The result will go to a monograph upon microscopic signatures upon the girdles of family brilliants, which no one will read, and I shall enjoy writing." "You shall have it," said Mr. Harcourt, with a bark that meant consent. We took our leave without fuss. The day had that peculiar brightness London manages in May, when the wind has come a mile up the river, and our cab bowled northward through a city that had decided not to remember yesterday's ugliness. Holmes sat easy, his hat a little back, his long fingers drumless upon his knee. At the corner by the Chronicle office he nodded toward the steps where he had first taxed me with Fleet Street dust. "Observe, Watson, how trifles carry a man." A grain of rouge on tissue, the whirl of cobbler's wax on a chair, a hair bright with tack, the petty economy of a blunt pen, each vulgar, each beneath the dignity of a jewel, and yet they did the work. The grandees, as I told you, betray themselves by little habits as surely as kings by their signatures. One day you will write me down as a lover of trifles and be done. "I shall write you down," I answered, "as a man who sees through veils." He laughed under his breath. "A veil is a pretty thing, but it does not hide a weight. It is our duty to feel for the weight, and not be put off by the lace. There ends the philosophy of the case of the bride who carried 2 veils. That evening, back in Baker Street, he drew out his violin and sent a thin ribbon of melody across the room, sweet and level, without those sudden flashes of passion to which he is prone when a problem has left him unsatisfied. When he set it by, he spoke as if to the air. "Rook will straighten his cloth, Barnes will fuss over his ledger, Varden will do honest work for a season or for ever, according to the metal in him. Martell will thread needles in a cleaner place than a gaming hell. Lionel will learn that shame is heavier than debt. The The star sits where it ought. The rest is the city's business. And ours? I asked. Ours, said he, reaching for the cigarette case, is to wait for the next piece of human vanity to trip over its own invention. If it brings with it a little cobbler's wax, so much the better for us. He smiled, not unkindly, through the smoke. You may give the thing a title and send it to the Gazette in due course, my dear fellow. Only do not make a romance of it. It was a demonstration, plain as a parish register. I own I have not obeyed him. For there are demonstrations which, once witnessed, turn willy-nilly into romances in the memory, and this was of that rare order. Yet if I have dwelt upon veils and stars, it is not for their glitter, but because, in the hands of my friend, they became what all honest proofs become, a clear line drawn through a tangle until the shape that was always there stands forth and asks only to be recognized. Holmes had returned to his armchair by the fire, his long form stretched with the indolence of a man whose mind has spent itself fully and well. The evening shadows lay thick upon Baker Street, broken only by the amber glow of the lamp and the faint, metallic glimmer from the case of the Harcourt star, which rested closed upon the mantel. I had set down the last notes of the affair, yet still my thoughts circled the paths of deception and discovery with that strange fascination which always lingers after one has trodden in Holmes's wake. "You are dwelling, Watson," Holmes remarked, without lifting his lids, "upon the cruelty of betrayal within a family." "It is natural, though hardly useful. I cannot help but wonder," I admitted, "how a man could so coolly plot against his own blood and upon her wedding day of all times." "Ah," said Holmes, opening his eyes, "there is no crime so cold as that which necessity baptizes as reason. Lionel Pelling had debts gnawing at his heels, pride stung by the family jewel that had mocked his poverty, and a convenient accomplice in Martel. A desperate man will plunder any altar, of law, of love, or of God, if he fancies it may buy him breath. But do not forget, Watson, that desperation leaves the messiest footprints, and it was by those vulgar smears of wax and chalk that I followed him to his undoing." "And Varden?" I asked her. "Would you have pressed for his prosecution?" Holmes waved a hand languidly. "The law is a bludgeon, not a scalpel. It is sometimes wiser to frighten a rogue back into honesty than to parade him in the dock. He has returned the stone and confessed enough to leash him for the rest of his days. I doubt he will lift another jewel save to polish it." I stirred the embers with the poker. "And Miss Harcourt, her dignity through such an ordeal. It was the very quality that enabled the solution," Holmes cut in, a rare warmth in his voice. "She bore the veils with steadiness, and by doing so carried the truth into the open. Without her calm endurance, my little experiments with thread and wax would have been useless. It is not always the detective who holds the greatest courage in these affairs, Watson." He rose then, reached for the violin, and set it gently beneath his chin. The first notes floated upward, delicate as the lace that had hidden a kingdom of fire. His gaze, half abstracted, lingered upon the window where the fog pressed softly against the pane, as if London itself leaned in to listen. "The case of the bride who carried 2 veils," he mused between phrases, "will never be reckoned among my grander adventures, nor does it boast the melodrama that the Strand's readers seem to crave. Yet it is one of those little demonstrations by which nature reminds us that nothing, however small, is beneath notice. A hair upon a veil, a smear upon a chair, a feather within a diamond, each speaks as loudly as a pistol if one has the patience to hear. He played on, the notes gathering in strength, and then softening to a sigh. At length the bow fell idle, and Holmes set the violin aside. He turned to me with that familiar half-smile which signalled both weariness and triumph. "And now, my dear fellow," he said, "let the world call it romance if it must. You and I shall know it for what it was, a veil lifted, a shadow dispelled, and truth, always truth, standing where it had stood from the beginning, waiting for the eye that could see it." So ended the affair, leaving me once more astonished at the breadth of my friend's genius and at the curious frailties of men who, blinded by pride or desperation, weave plots as delicate and as easily torn as lace. And I could not help but think, as the fire dwindled low, that the true star recovered that week was not a jewel set in gold, but the quiet radiance of honour restored.